So the theme is so complex. It holds the deepest question of existence, manifestation. Who are we? Why are we here? The Indian idea is that sarvam khalvidam brahmanasti. Everything is already that. Everything is the anant, the wholeness, the infinite. But we don't experience that. We experience something that is the opposite. So when I looked at the theme that Claire sent me, I said, wow, how to translate that? I know all of you are artists, and what you have is more an imaginative, you see in pictures, you don't necessarily have an imagination of literary or words. So I have to translate it into words. So already the duality is here in my talk. So that's why I wanted to focus a little bit on poetry. At the same time, especially for those of you who have come from elsewhere in India, it's very important to understand the difference, the clear difference that Sri Aurobindo represents to everything that has happened in India before. It is true that the only country in the world that has the highest spiritual aspiration is India. But somehow this spiritual aspiration got translated into abandoning life. Now Sri Aurobindo comes along and says, no, life itself, life has to be transformed. So the yoga of Sri Aurobindo is about changing life. So that's why I felt that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what Sri Aurobindo's yoga represents, what Auroville represents in this yoga, and then I'll try to give you a taste of the poetry, which I hope gives you enough images of the finite, infinite theme to help you in your artwork for the next week. So the theme of the art camp is every finite is an infinite and has to be known and sensed in its intrinsic infiniteness as well as its surface finite appearances. So we have this strange duality. That which is finite is infinite, but you only know it and experience it in this death-bound littleness. Our bodies die. So what we experience is transience. We never hold anything. How in this state of consciousness where everything passes, how can we hold the sense of wholeness? The Upanishad has this wonderful mantra, Purnamadav, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnamujjate, Chatte, Purnasya, Purnamadaya, Purnameva, Vashishyate, which says, if you experience fullness, this is full, that is full. If you take something out of fullness, fullness remains. So how can we create a consciousness of fullness? Because that's when we touch the infinite, the wholeness. I'm reading 4-5 lines from Savitri to start with. A mystery process is the universe. At first was laid a strange anomalous base, a void or cipher of some secret hole, where zero held infinity in its sum, and all or nothing were a single term. If you think of the scientific way the universe has come about, we talk about first there's nothing and suddenly there is a big bang, there's an explosion. So it's it's a real universe, but it's also impossible. How out of nothing has all this come about? So that's a question that science cannot answer. In Savitri, Sri Aurobindo says, our life is a holocaust of the Supreme. The great world mother, by her sacrifice, has made her soul the body of our state. So it is as if we, first of all, how do we hold ourselves together? What holds us together? We are just made of atoms and molecules. every atom, every molecule that contains us, is contained in us, is the mother, is the universal mother. So that Sarvam Khalvidam Brahmanasti is equally this, because the universe has bodied forth from that which was there before the universe bodied forth, and every particle in the universe, every electron in the universe is that already. The master knot that we have to solve is how to hold the two together. Sri Aurobindo says, in itself, this is from the synthesis, it is Sachidananda. The Upanishad, when it's speaking of the source of the universe, says it's a triune Sat, which is pure existence, Chit, which is conscious force, and Ananda, which is delight. So everything that is or is already Sachidananda, but this complexity, this knotting up and unraveling of the infinite in the finite is the aspect we see it assume in universal and in individual nature. It's the central secret of the psychological complexity. It's the cause of our problems and difficulties. So the key to understanding life is to try to understand this master knot. Now, many traditional spiritual disciplines just sit upon these questions. Silence the mind, quieten the life force, still the body, lift yourself up, above, rise to a higher state of consciousness, go back into a deeper state of consciousness, quieten everything else, and you get some of the great experiences that are known in spiritual disciplines. But Sri Aurobindo says, no, that's not the way. Yes, you have to do this. You have to do everything that I just described, but that's just the beginning. The more you quieten yourself, the more you discover all the knots in your nature, the more you lift yourself up, it's only a power to bring yourself back down into life, into matter, into all the difficulties of the external world so that you can transform them. You have to bring it down. So in this yoga, it's a rising up is only the first step in a bringing down. Because this is a yoga, it's integral. Sri Aurobindo calls it integral because there is a verticality and a horizontality, a concentric. Am I using too many difficult words? No. It's okay? So there is something that goes this way and there's something that goes that way. Horizontally, you have to cover all the planes within you, outside of you. Vertically, you have to cover all the planes within you and extending above and extending below into the nescience, into the superconscious. So in this yoga, you cannot abandon anything. You have to harness everything, which makes it kind of impossible. No? Given the state of who we are. So Julie read you actually the 6 points of to be a true Aurovillian are a complete yoga of transformation. And if you notice, the last 2 points talk about a next step in evolution. So one of the things that Sri Aurobindo, it's just the basis of what Sri Aurobindo is saying. Why have we assumed that the human consciousness, which is so divided and which is so incomplete and which is so troubled, is the final step of evolution? Why do we assume that? This is the arrogance of the mind that thinks it knows and it thinks it's the best. It is true, it is in a sense this self-conscious, self-aware mentality that is the human consciousness has given us mastery over the material world, has given us the power to change. We are highly adaptable. We can do just about anything we set our minds to do. We have changed earth consciousness. We have changed the world that we live in. We're changing it so badly that we might even destroy it for ourselves. But that'll be like by chance, not because That's what we plan, but we need to harness the world. We have to harness everything the world provides us for our ego self, which is one of the master knots of nature, this self-centered, egoistic mentality. But is this the end? Sri Aurobindo says, no. There is a next step in evolution. So Auroville is squarely dedicated to creating environmental conditions where this next step could take place. For this next step to take place, you need to provide absolute freedom. Freedom to be the raw individual that you are. You're egoistic, if that's what it is. Now, society creates all these moral conditions that controls it. But now in Auroville, we try to avoid having rules. That's the intention of the experiment. We don't succeed very well, but that's the intention. Because the individual has to be left totally free to discover the incapacities as well as the capacities. And it's only in freedom. So one of the core truths of Auroville is absolute freedom. But freedom to grow, freedom to develop, freedom to widen your consciousness. There is no limit to the growth of consciousness. So Sri Aurobindo is not a teaching. Sri Aurobindo is not a revelation. Sri Aurobindo is an action. And when in the ashram people were preparing for the 100th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo, which fell in 1972, there were some people in the ashram who were preparing some introductions to Sri Aurobindo. It was the first time that from the ashram people were going out into India and introducing Sri Aurobindo to India. I think of all the people who have come to teach something, some spiritual truth, in some ways Sri Aurobindo is the most misunderstood in India. He doesn't fall into the line of spiritual teachers at all. He is radical. He is universal. He says we do not belong to the past dawns, we belong to the noons of the future. Whereas he has explored the Veda, the Upanishad, the Bhagavad Gita, the Puranas, the Tantra. He has explored everything, he's analyzed everything. Individually, personally, I have never found such wonderful explanations as you find in Sri Aurobindo, because Sri Aurobindo answers questions. Sri Aurobindo doesn't say it is like that. He'll tell you, give you reasons why it is so. He explores all the spiritual thought of the world. But he's still in action, because what he is saying is, yes, that's what it was. But his energy and his power and his focus is to leap into the future. He bases himself on the Upanishadic idea that it is delight, it is Ananda that has bodied forth the universe. And when you inhabit not pleasure, delight, Ananda, when you inhabit that Ananda, then you are most in tune with the universe that is in progression. Because we are not living in a static universe. We are living in a universe that is vastly progressing, and to be able to be in harmony with the rhythm of the universe, which is the rhythm of truth, which is the rhythm of beauty, which is the rhythm of light and power and all the divine energies that are available to us. To be in that rhythm, you have to be in a rhythm of growth of consciousness. Otherwise, you're out of that rhythm. The moment you settle down and say, okay, this is it, no, you stop progressing. So the greatest gift that you can give yourself in your life is to have a sense of progress, to have a sense of development always. Expansion, widening. The Veda says, Satyam Ritam Brihat. That which is truth, which is existence, is true and exists because it is right, it is balanced. What in Hindi we say Rita. The Rita is the rhythm of the right season to do the right thing at the right moment. Ritam, so it's kind of truth in manifestation, and Brihat, it has to be vast. It has to be wide. Yes, so all of these, Sri Aurobindo affirms, he says, the Veda has a truth, has a secret that humanity needs to rediscover. Unfortunately, the Veda has been interpreted as Karmakanta. But it is secret knowledge, and it holds the key to something of the future. The Upanishad is recognized all over the world. So Sri Aurobindo looks at all of these great traditions of the past, but they have to be harnessed for the future, the noons of the future. And one of the things that comes to today's world, to the humanity of today, is a synthesis of cultures, a synthesis of knowledge. So we cannot create an India that is exclusive. We have to receive gratefully everything that comes from every corner of the world. And one of the things that the West has had in the last many centuries is a mind capable of progress, capable of growing in consciousness, which is why the West has dominated in the last few centuries, because it's been the age of science, the age of enlightenment. Stagnation happens when the mind stops growing. Now in India we say truth, the mind is not an instrument of truth. The mind is a seeker for truth. The mind is an instrument. It's not who you are. In the West we have the idea that cogito ergo sum. This is Descartes who says, I think and therefore I am. In India we say it's when your mind falls silent, then you are. It's not a ratiocinative consciousness that solves the knot of nature. So it is true that you have to fall silent, but it is not true that the mind doesn't make progress. The mind has to constantly respond to what the universe is sending to it. And if this universe is progressing at a tremendous speed, and you need to keep up. And the only way to keep up is to be in that silence, beyond the cosmos. The energies of the universe come from beyond, and they grow forward. So there is an upper hemisphere, and there is a lower hemisphere. Sri Aurobindo accepts in his yoga the Vedantic. Veda and Vedanta are called the ideas. They have given the principles to Indian spiritual thought. So the Vedantic idea that we live in a sevenfold world. The upper hemisphere is Sat, Chit, Ananda. Then there is a fourth plane which belongs to the upper hemisphere, Vijnana, which Sri Aurobindo calls supermind. And then you have the lower hemisphere of mind, life and body. We are mostly life and body beings. We are discovering, the mind is growing in us. We are not really Buddhiman. The Buddha, he's called the Buddha because he's awake in the deepest sense of what the mind is capable of. So we are half asleep. Shakespeare says we do everything between sleep and awake. So the mind is in the process of finding itself, but it belongs to the lower hemisphere. So you have these two hemispheres. Now what Sri Aurobindo noticed is that you cannot change the world from a mind plane, even the highest mind plane, which he calls the overmind. So his whole yoga was aimed at the fourth plane, the Turiyam Svid of the Veda, what he calls the supermind. So he spent his whole life trying to bring this down. He actually consciously chose to go into death because he was not able to bring it down in his body in his lifetime. So in 1950, he chose to give up his body. And it took another 6 years. So one of the dates that's very important in the Auroville calendar, in the Aurobindonian calendar, is the 29th of February 1956, when finally this fourth plane, which has been seen and been spoken of from Vedic times, but in the Veda it is argued that this Turyam Svidh, if a rishi grows in consciousness and touches this plane of consciousness, you necessarily need to abandon the body. You cannot keep a body and live in that plane. If you go into that plane, you have to abandon the body. So what Sri Aurobindo's whole aim was to bring this plane into manifestation. Individuals have touched it through history, through millennia. In time and space, yes, there has been an individual encounter with this plane. But Sri Aurobindo is not satisfied with that. He wants to bring it into the earth consciousness. So in 1956, they succeeded, the mother and Sri Aurobindo, in their yoga, and this plane came into manifestation. It is actually directly the consequence of this plane that today we are sitting here and talking, because it makes an experiment like Auroville possible. If you look at it, so that's kind of a little bit an introduction to Sri Aurobindo's yoga, and if you have questions later, you know what I'm doing? I'm just leaping from one mountain peak to the next. So I'm just throwing out very impressionistic ideas of something that he's written books and books and books about. But I mean, just to give you a taste of that, I hope it's not too esoteric. But now I'm coming to Auroville. 1956, we have this manifestation. Manifestation means it becomes part of the earth consciousness. Then something begins to change. Lots of very interesting things take place. And then about 1964, Mother begins to talk about an old idea that she and Sri Aurobindo had. Necessarily, because their yoga is turned to the earth consciousness, it requires people. A collectivity, an aspiring collectivity that dedicates itself to a collective realization. You know that in India you can always find personal realization. And it's perfectly good for yourself as an individual. You do not need Sri Aurobindo's yoga for self-realization. Sri Aurobindo's yoga begins beyond a little bit that. So Sri Aurobindo's yoga is about collective realization, because you need to create a critical mass of consciousnesses that can hold a little bit in matter, on the ground, in life, something of this spiritual truth that they have envisioned. So you need a collectivity. You have the individual, you have humanity as a whole, and you have this intermediate term of a conscious collectivity. So first the Sri Aurobindo Ashram and then Auroville represent these intermediate collectivities which become holding environments for a collective realization. So this was an old idea. Mother always dreamed of creating a kind of a city of God. A place where you could build a new mind, a new body, a new life in a collective setting where everybody would become just one element. Nobody is a boss, nobody is a leader. Everybody is in a servitude, in a kind of like a quarry of the gods. We're all little workers, manual laborers in building a new consciousness in matter. So 64, the idea of Auroville begins to be spoken about. It takes another few years for it to manifest. In 1968, on the 28th of February, Auroville is announced, but it's announced. 5,000 people come to this plateau. It's barren. It's highly desertified. They put the handful of earth from all the member states of UNESCO plus all the states of India into a lotus urn. You will be visiting the center of Auroville, the Matri Mandir, and you will see this. And there's a big ceremony, 5,000 people on this plateau, and the next day, empty. Nothing, nobody. So you see this duality even in the manifestation of Auroville. You have this great idea. At that time, a kind of a spiral master plan, concept galaxy was flashed around the world. So for many years, in the early years, people would come and say, where's the town? There was no town. There is no town still. It's the consciousness that is being built. It's the human consciousness that has to be the holding environment for the town of the future that has to come. Yes, Auroville is meant to be a town because you need enough people in it to create a critical mass. If you notice in human history, cities have always been the center of the greatest changes that humanity has made, and also cities have always been an expression of the darkest, the underbelly of human consciousness. A lot of troublesome things happen in cities and a lot of the fabulous results. You don't get results out of pastoral environments that are very loose and free. You need concentration because human beings need to rub against each other to grow and change. So Auroville is meant to be a small town, and that's still happening. So you are visiting a work in progress. And okay, I've been here 47 years. B, more or less the same amount of time, no? Yes. And some of us have gotten much older, and you realize that it's not so easy to bring about collective change of consciousness. It's not so obvious, it's not so simple, and yet it's fun. So what you have to get yourself into is the joy of the process and not be bothered too much about the result. And I guess as artists you should understand that it's the process more than an end result, and it's always a work in progress, I guess, what you're doing. So you as artists are always aiming towards beauty. Sri Aurobindo and Mother say that in matter, in manifestation, the divine manifests as beauty. So the question then is, how can we find delight? So Ananda is the plane of the upper hemisphere. In Indian spiritual thought, we are embodied up till Ananda. We have 5 bodies. I guess a lot of the Indians would have heard of that. You have the material body, which is called Anna Kosha. And the Upanishad says we call it Anna because it is food. It is eaten because it eats. The eater eating is eaten. So you have the gross body, the physical body, Annam, matter, is food. We call it food because it eats and it is eaten. So you have the gross physical body, then you have the life body, Prana Kosha, then you have the mental sheath, Mana Kosha, and the Upanishad says the mental being is the leader, Manomaya Purusha, Prana Sharira Neta. So the mental being who is the leader of the life and the body, very, very important. The mind is the key because it can accelerate evolution. It's the key to doing yoga also, because with the power of the mind, you can accelerate your own process of development. You need to harness the mind. You don't need to throw it away. You need to put it as a servant of a higher consciousness. So, Mana Kosha. Then there is the Vijnana Kosha. There is the knowledge sheath. And finally, there is the Ananda Kosha. So we have the last 2 planes, Chit, Tapas and Sat, are states. They're not bodied. But in this universe we live in, we have embodiments. And Ananda is embodied. So I have a conversation of Mother where she's trying to explain, it's a puzzling question. Why are we in this universe? What is this universe? What are we doing here in it? And so she's trying to explain identity versus union. I'll read it to you. So the solution is to find Ananda, even in the play, in the exchange in which one both gives and receives, in which one seems to be two. And that is why one keeps the duality, this finite infinite. Otherwise, in identity, nothing remains but identity. There is often an attempt to make everything uniform, to make everything one by uniformity. No, that's not the solution. The universe demands the multiplicity, but a union in multiplicity, which makes it very difficult. Otherwise, in identity, nothing remains but identity. If the identity is complete and perfect, there is no more objectivization. I said that it begins with the Ananda of identity, and after the full circuit, meaning the circuit of manifestation of the creation, it ends in the Ananda of union. Well, if there had been no circuit, there would never have been the Ananda of union. And perhaps it is just in order that the Ananda of identity may find what I might call its consummation and crowning in the Ananda of union that the whole circuit was made. So that is Mother's explanation of why we live in this very messed up finitude. It's because we have to find the infinite in manifestation, each of us. And if we touch that infinitude in manifestation, we touch it in everybody, including ourselves. Sri Aurobindo has a lovely aphorism, one of his thoughts, as if honey could taste itself and all its drops together, and each, not only that each honey drop tastes itself and tastes all the other drops as itself, and it also tastes the whole honeycomb. If somehow you can wrap your head around that, that's kind of the multiplicity. Ananda, when it manifests in two ways. It manifests as beauty, which is what you are all seeking as artists, and it manifests as love. I have said about love, the manifestation of love, which is the supreme Ananda, beyond being and non-being, there is something which is, which manifests as supreme love, and which is at once being and non-being. And the first manifestation of that is the Ananda of identity, becoming aware of itself in Ananda. And then it makes the full circuit through the whole manifestation and all the forms taken by love, and returns to the oneness through union. And this adds to that Ananda, the Ananda of union, which would never have existed if the circuit had not been made. There is a moment in Savitri where she's arrived at the point where she's touching the first plane, which is called nirvana, which is a sort of a negation, all negating consciousness. And this is Savitri arriving at that moment of disappearance. Unutterably effaced, no one and null, a vanished vestige like a violet trace, a faint record merely of a self now past. She was a point in the unknowable. So she disappears. But that's not the end. She disappears. She becomes a vanished vestige like a violet trace. And then she, beyond being and non-being, there is that which is, which in the Isha Upanishad, there is a line which says, "He in whom the self has become all existences, who sees everywhere oneness, how shall he have delusion? Whence shall he have grief, who sees everywhere oneness?" Ka moha, ka shoka, ekatva manupashyata. When you see oneness everywhere, you cannot experience sorrow. You cannot experience delusion. You cannot experience division. Because you see the divine everywhere. You see the divine in everything. This is a truth that India can offer to the world. Because we've had that experience. But can we do it collectively? Can we do it inclusively? Because this is another thing that Mother says, and she's speaking about Auroville. And every branch of human knowledge has been a failure because they were exclusive. And man has been a failure because he was exclusive. And what the new consciousness wants, it is on this that it insists. When Julie read out, she spoke about the new consciousness in the last two invocations to be a true Aurovillian, that the whole earth is preparing for a new step in evolution. And this is the new consciousness Mother is speaking about. So this new consciousness demands no more divisions. To be able to understand the spiritual extreme and the material extreme, and to find the meeting point, the point where that becomes a real force. So the key to Auroville's success is finding this meeting point between the spiritual extreme and the material extreme. Now, that's kind of the duality, that's kind of the difficulty, that's the master knot that we confront as Aurovillians. It's sort of, Auroville's an impossible experiment, because you're never going to arrive at the fullness of it in a body that's bound to death and to littleness. But kind of that's the experience that Auroville is asking for. How you all doing? Is it okay? Is it an overdose of things? No? It's working all right? So, I was going to go to Savitri. What? I was going to read you, I'll end with Savitri, and I was going to read you when Savitri arrives at the cosmic spirit and when she becomes everything. It's very beautiful, and I think you should hear it in Sri Aurobindo's words. But I thought, who are the people who come to Auroville? If you are here in Auroville and you begin to say, is this a place for me? What am I supposed to do? How should I live my life? Well, here is one of the things that Mother says about the sort of people that choose to come here. She says, it is a selection. From an external standpoint, you could say that there are people in the world who are far superior to you, and I would not disagree. But from an occult standpoint, it's a selection. It can be said that without a doubt, a majority of the young people here have come because it was promised them that they would be present at the hour of realization, but they don't remember it. I've already said several times that when you come down on earth, you fall on your head, which leaves you a little dazed. She's laughing. It's a pity, but after all, you don't have to remain dazed all your life, do you? You should go deep within yourself and there find the immortal consciousness. Then you can see very well, and you can see very clearly, and remember the circumstances in which you aspire to be here for the hour of the work's completion. The idea is that the earth as a whole must be prepared in all its forms, including even those least ready for the transformation. There must be a symbolic representation of all the elements on earth upon which we can work to establish the link. The earth is a symbolic representation of the universe, and the group is a symbolic representation of the earth. Sri Aurobindo and I had discussed the matter in 1914, quite a long time ago. For we had seen two possibilities: what we are now doing, or to withdraw into solitude and isolation until we had not only attained the supermind, that's Duriam Svit, but begun the material transformation as well. And Sri Aurobindo rightly said that we could not isolate ourselves, for as you progress, you become more and more universalized, and consequently, you take the burden upon yourself in any case. So because they want transformation, because they don't want to withdraw, all the great leaders, whether it's Jesus Christ or Buddha or Mahavir or Nanak, all the great leaders of the past have realized first and then turned to humanity. But Sri Aurobindo and Mother don't do that because their work is transformation. So they left it open. And life itself has responded by bringing forward people to form a nucleus. Of course, we clearly saw that this would make the work a bit more complex and difficult. It gives me a heavy responsibility and enormous material work. The Sri Aurobindo ashram grew up around the mother. She is the one who created it. So she's saying she's got a lot of responsibilities. But from the overall point of view, for the work, it's indispensable and even inevitable. And in any case, as we were later able to verify, each one represents simultaneously a possibility and a special difficulty to resolve. I have even said, I believe, that each one here is an impossibility.
We know.
So there's no credit to us. Yes, there is a credit that we've chosen to be here.
Yes.
And that's a gift. That's a wonderful gift. But we have a lot of work to do. Okay, how are you doing? Is it okay that I read Savitri? Yeah? Everyone?
Yes.
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 For you all?
Yes.
The English is okay?
Yes.
Yeah? So I'll come back to the House of the Spirit, which
Can
I feel
interrupt
some...
you for a
Huh?
minute? Can I interrupt you?
Yes, please.
Can you give us a little bit more, like an introduction
What is
about
Savitri?
Because I don't have the
Okay.
context.
When Sri Aurobindo speaks about himself, he doesn't say, he says, I wrote philosophy, but I'm not a philosopher. He wrote a great deal of history, he wrote a great deal of social and political thought. He comments on everything that's happening in the world. He's not a historian, he's not a sociologist, he's not a philosopher. He doesn't even call himself a spiritual leader. He certainly doesn't want to be a spiritual teacher. People come around him somehow, but he never intended to make an ashram, really. It happened. He calls himself a poet. So his primary self-expression is through poetry. And then most of Sri Aurobindo's writing took place during the period of the First World War, when he launched a magazine called the Arya. Between 1914 and 1920, his library of books comes out of there. After, when he withdrew and the mother started the ashram, which is 1926, after that he did not write anything in prose. He refused to write prose writings. There is 3-4 volumes of his letters. He wrote a lot of letters to the sadhaks, who were all very puzzled about the yoga that he was proposing. So if you want to understand Sri Aurobindo's yoga, go to the letters on yoga. Actually, there are 5 volumes, because he's also written on literature, poetry, art. He's written on things about the world. He's not somebody who doesn't comment on what's happening. He's interested in the world. He had a radio during the Second World War, and he was listening to news bulletins all the time, because he was deeply interested in what's happening in the world. But his personal poetic expression is in Savitri. Now he takes a story that appears for the first time in the Mahabharata. You know, the Mahabharata is 100,000 verses, and there's always a story within a story within a story. And so at some point in time, I think the Pandavas are asking about devoted wives and the Sati Savitris.
Oh, okay.
And so there is a teacher who tells the story of Savitri, which is a story of conjugal love. But Sri Aurobindo says that in the story, even the names are significant. If you look at the Sanskrit meaning of the names, Savitri, Dyumatsena, Ashwapati, if you understand the spiritual significance, the Sanskrit meanings of the words, they represent something, they're symbolic. So he's taken this story, and it's a legend, and he's converted it into a symbol. And he has used Savitri to express his ascension to higher and higher planes. So each time he touched a higher plane of consciousness, he rewrote Savitri. So from, I think he started Savitri even before 1920, but till 1950, almost the last thing he was doing was reworking Savitri. So if you want to encounter Sri Aurobindo, it is true he writes in English, but it's an English that's unique because he borrows from every language of the world, and it's totally embodying the Indian ethos. It is Savitri. Right?
Does that mean that Savitri has been rewritten and has been published?
No, the final version is what is published.
Okay.
Because you respect...
I was wanting to trace, what's been revised, but that's not
No,
possible.
it's only Sri Aurobindo we follow his line.
Yeah.
So when he gave his final version, there has been a great work in the ashram to make sure you get the final version the poet wanted. So it's basically an encounter. He calls Savitri love, and death is the thing that Savitri wants to conquer, to bring back her husband who has been taken by death. And even in the original story, she wins back Satyavan. But in this, it's love that conquers death. So it's very beautiful. It's what I started to read when I was 16. It speaks to anybody. It's mystic poetry, so it's unusual. It's a bit like the Upanishad of the future. So there is an element of secret words in it, but you don't have to understand it with the head, you have to just let it flow through you. Yes? That's okay?
Yeah.
So this is when Savitri she spent the whole year after she marries Satyavan, she's sitting in the forest and doing all the work as a good wife in the forest, but she's doing a yoga. Because she has to be ready to face death. And to be able to face death, she has to do a huge sadhana. And she has 1 year to do it. Now she's arrived at the fullness of her sadhana. She's gone through nirvana. She's gone through all the planes of the world. And she's arrived beyond nirvana at the cosmic spirit and the cosmic consciousness. A lot of Sri Aurobindo's writings use a little bit the Bhagavad Gita. In Sri Aurobindo's life, Sri Krishna is a very powerful presence. So his synthesis of yoga is written on the Bhagavad Gita principles. Plus he's added something more. He takes the Trimarga of the Bhagavad Gita, Jnana Bhakti Karma, and he adds a fourth layer, the yoga of self-perfection. So he adds many layers. So now she's arrived at the fullness of time, and she is now uniting with the cosmic consciousness. Her spirit saw the world as living God. It saw the One and knew that all was He. She was a single being, yet all things. The world was her spirit's wide circumference. The thoughts of others were her intimates, their feelings close to her universal heart. Their bodies, her many bodies, kin to her. She was no more herself, but all the world. Out of the infinitudes, all came to her. Into the infinitudes, sentient she spread. Infinity was her own natural home. Nowhere she dwelt, her spirit was everywhere. The distant constellations wheeled round her. Earth saw her born. All worlds were her colonies. The greater worlds of life and mind were hers. All nature reproduced her in its lines. Its movements were large copies of her own. She was the single self of all these selves. She was in them, and they were all in her. The first was an immense identity in which her own identity was lost. What seemed herself was an image of the whole. She was a subconscient life of tree and flower. The outbreak of the honeyed buds of spring. She burned in the passion and splendor of the rose. She was the red heart of the passion flower, the dream white of the lotus in its pool. Out of subconscient life, she climbed to mind. She was thought and the passion of the world's heart. She was the Godhead hid in the heart of man. She was the climbing of his soul to God. The cosmos flowered in her. She was its bed. She was time and the dreams of God in time. She was space and the wideness of his days. From this she rose where time and space were not. The superconscient was her native air. Infinity was her movement's natural space. Eternity looked out from her on time. And typical, right after this, you have the Book of Death. So once she has touched this totality of superconscience, she's ready to face death. I should stop. I had a few more quotes but I think that's a good ending. Yeah? If you have questions, if you have thoughts. हिंदी में पूछ लो.
बिल्कुल. जैसे मैम हम जैसे आप बता रही थी और हम जैसे जब हम सोचते हैं, जैसे अपन दिल्ली में रहते हैं तो पेंट करते वक्त हम बहुत डीपली जाते हैं, फिर हम सोचते हैं कि यार ये चीज़ हम महसूस करते हैं, फील कर पाते हैं, बट जब हम बाहर निकलते हैं तो दुनिया ऐसी है कि हम पेंटिंग में तो उस चीज़ को कर पा रहे हैं, लेकिन हम बाहर लाइफ में उस चीज़ को जी नहीं पा रहे हैं. मार्केट है, पॉलिटिक्स है, बहुत सारी चीज़ें हैं, तो हम सरवाइव नहीं कर सकते हैं उस तरह से. लेकिन हम इस चीज़ को जानते हुए भी, तो यहाँ के जो आप बताई, ऐसा लग रहा है कि हाँ इम्पॉसिबल कुछ नहीं है, पॉसिबल है जो आप लोग कर रहे हो. लेकिन इस चीज़ को जीना हम लोग के लिए, शायद हम यहाँ से कुछ लेके जाए, लेकिन कभी पॉलिटिक्स, जैसे हमारे देश में पॉलिटिक्स ने बहुत सारी चीज़ों को बांट दिया, लैंग्वेज है, ये सारी चीज़ें हैं, बट ओरिजिनलिटी क्या है, यही है. लेकिन हम इसको जी नहीं पाते हैं चाह के भी. तो यहाँ के जो आपने बताया बहुत ही अच्छा लगा. और हम पेंटिंग में तो वो चीज़ अप्लाई करते हैं, बट अपने जीवन में चाह के भी नहीं कर पाते हैं.
बट ये सच हमारे लिए भी सच है कि हम अंदर पकड़ सकते हैं पर अप्लाई नहीं कर सकते. हमारी ज़िंदगी आपके जैसे ज़िंदगी है, हम अलग नहीं हैं. So his point is that in terms of poetry, he can capture these ideas when he's painting, but then when he goes to outer life and you see the politics and you see the divisions and you see the trouble living in a city like Delhi, it's very hard to combine the two experiences. So I said the same truth is here also. This truth doesn't go away because it's the question of life. And that's what Sri Aurobindo's question is, how to transform life. But the Upanishad tells you that there is a state of consciousness. Ka moha, ka shoka, ekatva manupashyata. If you can see oneness everywhere, then somehow you can at least hold the master knot in a space and be what you are. The two truths coexist. Outer shocks, inner sweetnesses.
No, but I would even go further than you, Deepti, because we have experimented in Auroville so often that if we can keep silent this truth and fight for it and concentrate in it, even in the Resident Assembly General meeting, which is a maelstrom of diversity and contradiction, something is manifest, something can go through.
He's saying he does that,
Yeah.
but when he's by himself but when he goes out into the marketplace, it becomes more difficult. Is all he's saying.
I'm speaking of
The
the
marketplace.
experiment that we have in Auroville in groups.
But,
and this is, it has really a power. It has a power, definitely. Not a radical one. 5 minutes after, it's again the mess. But I guess that is something accumulating.
But that's the question of life. And the more you can touch deeper elements, the more well-being you have, the more fullness you have. You have no right not to be full. So at all costs, keep yourself full. Full in the sense of a sense of well-being. कि अपना एटमॉस्फेयर जहाँ भी आप जाओ अपना एटमॉस्फेयर रखिए.
एक्चुअली शायद सबका तो नहीं बता सकता, लेकिन मैं अपना बताऊँ तो मुझे पसंद है ये सब चीज़ें. बनना तो मैं ऐसा ही चाहता हूँ, लेकिन शायद अब ये सारी चीज़ें हैं कि हमें फंसा के रखती हैं बाहर की चीज़ें.
यही कह रहे हैं कि कर्म में ही ये सब ढूंढना है आपको.
हाँ,
कर्म नहीं छोड़ना है. तो
And
कर्म में
there
ही
is
ढूंढना है.
there is a very false idea in India. If you think of this traditional social system of the 4 ashramas. So you say, I am not in the Vanprasthan stage. It's not yet time for me to do yoga. What does that mean? You should start yoga at 6 years if you can. The sooner the better. So if you all can start to do yoga, means self-enabling, self-developing, self-expanding sadhana. तो आप जहाँ भी हैं आप कर सकते हैं. You don't have to do yoga in a place that's dedicated to yoga.
तो इसको बैठ के सिर्फ योग करने को नहीं है, योग आपका जीवन है, वो ये करने की कोशिश करें. जो आप जी रहे हो उसी को वही योग, उसको योग बनाओ.
I understand what you're saying, but the point is, it's you young people who need to start to do yoga in India. If all the Indians were doing yoga, wow, we would be the guru of the world then. No?
Didn't you say all art is yoga?
Yes. All life is yoga, Sri Aurobindo says. All art, all life, all living, if we can make it conscious. So Sri Aurobindo says, nature does yoga in us. But because we have a mind, we can do a self-conscious self-development, acceleration, growth, development. So if we can do that, and India is the one country where everyone knows this truth.
दीप्ति जी, श्री अरविंदो थॉट्स एंड एफोरिज्म में एक इंटरेस्टिंग बात कह रहे हैं. Hard is it to be in the world free, yet leading a life of ordinary man.
Yes.
Because it is hard, it must be attempted and accomplished.
Yes.
The word free is important in the ordinary world or anywhere. That to be free from anything that we see also initially said. No? To be free from that means whatever that we do, we are free from the result. If we maintain that attitude, anywhere in the world it is possible.
So one reason why Claire and Hervé are organizing these art camps is to create this kind of interchange and interaction where the community of the given, the ones who serve something deeper and truer, can keep expanding. Because the whole issue of the future is, can we concentrate a collectivity that is there both in space and in time? Because up to now we've not succeeded as a species. If you look at history, individuals have always caught flame and gone off to the other hemisphere. But in space and time to create a concentration. And today the humanity, the earth itself is facing an unprecedented crisis. So it is urgent that we create collectivities that expand all over the world, that serve the future. No?
Yes.
So, should we end on that note?
Can I make a comment?
Please.
No, of all that I heard, I could connect only from the Bhagavad Gita, because I thought of the Vishwarupa Darshan, the chapter 11, where Arjun sees everything and he says, "Tumhe jo dekhna hai wo mujh mein dekh, Ashwini Kumar ko dekho, ye whatever." So I thought of that, like in Savitri also, I think she had reached that stage where everything was within her, and you know, and
if everyone wants to know what does everyone know the reference? Chapter 11 in the Bhagavad Gita, suddenly Sri Krishna becomes this terrible Virat Roop, and he's got a big mouth, maw, he's swallowing up all the worlds, the peoples, and then and Arjuna says, "Show me the beneficent form." So Godhead the terrible, Godhead the beautiful. It's the two that coexist.
Yeah, and the second thing was like what he was talking. I was thinking about like if Shri Krishna told Arjuna in the battlefield where everybody was looking for his blood, when he could do his karma there, and the jnana was like he chose to give jnana at that point. So for us, I think it's much more comfortable in that sense. At least people are not looking.
But who knows tomorrow if war comes to your doorstep? Then like Arjuna and Sri Krishna, you still have to be in that inner state of embodiment where your action is guided by a higher principle. In that sense, Sri Aurobindo gives a lot of value to the Bhagavad Gita. There is something in the Bhagavad Gita that humanity can use. Because it's a scripture that comes at the most ghoram kartavyam, at the most difficult moment in a person's life. He's being asked to kill or be killed. What more difficulty can you face? But there are lots of stories in India. You remember the story of Mahabali in Kerala. Mahabali, the Vaman avatar comes, and Mahabali has become too powerful and he has to be controlled. And Vishnu as Vaman comes to him and says, just give me land worth 3 steps. And then of course he expands to the universe. But the story that I'm going to tell you is he puts his first step on earth, the second step in the heavens, and the third step he says where the universe can disappear, and Mahabali gives his head, and Vaman puts his foot on his head and pushes him down. It's like a conquest of the ego. But Mahabali has been so devoted and has offered his most precious possession that he says he needs a boon also. So Vishnu says, choose. He says, you stay with me always. So Vishnu goes with him and becomes his doorkeeper. So he doesn't abandon Mahabali. He puts his foot on his head, but he goes with him as his doorkeeper. So it's a delightful story. In India, you have these stories where even when there's destruction, there is resurrection. So that's what we should keep. It's a reassuring truth.